Welcome to Professor Pincushion. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to put together a simple yet elegant block quilt. The size of this quilt is about 40 by 54, so I'll show you how to put it together and bind it. Let's take a look at some of the supplies we'll need in order to put our quilt together. When making your own quilt, the most important thing you need, of course, is fabric. So you can see my collection of fabric up here. I'm using 100% cotton fabric, and they're 45 inches in width. So this green fabric is going to be my backing, and also I'm using it to create my binding. So of this one I got 2.5 yards. Then I got 5 different colors in order to make my quilt top. Of these fabrics I got 1/2 yard. Next we have our batting. So for our batting, there's cotton batting and then there's polyester batting, and the polyester batting comes in different thicknesses. Cotton batting is all one thickness and it's usually thin. If this is your first quilt, I recommend going with the cotton batting because it's a lot easier to work with. The size of my batting is 45 by 60 because I like to figure that it's going to be bigger than what I plan on making my quilt top. Next, we're going to need some safety pins, and this I usually like to have about 1 inch to 2 inches long. We have 100% cotton thread because I want everything in my quilt to be cotton. So that's why I got cotton thread for this project. We have straight pins and sewing needles, scissors, my rotary cutter, self-healing mat, and then a ruler in order to cut out my quilt squares. And then we have basting spray. So this is going to help when we're trying to sandwich our quilt together. The only thing not shown here is our iron and our sewing machine. So that's the only other things that you need that you can't see here. Before we start cutting out our quilt, it's very important that if you plan on washing it, which is what most people plan to do, you pre-treat your fabric. This is before you cut anything out. So if you're doing 100% cotton, go ahead and wash it and dry it and all that kind of stuff, because you're going to run into problems later after you make the quilt if you don't do this first. Once it's all cleaned, go ahead and press out your fabric. And now we're going to start cutting out our strips. Now you can do this with scissors if you want, because basically we need blocks that are 8.5 by 8.5 inches. It's a lot easier though if you have the mat and the rotary cutter. It just goes along a lot faster and it's easier to be more accurate, because it's very important that you cut out your pieces as carefully as possible, because then it looks like everything lines up and matches up once you start putting your squares together. So that's why it's important to be very careful and to do things accurately when you're doing quilting. So what I'm going to do here, I have one piece here, this is 1/2 yard, and I went ahead, it's actually folded in half and then folded in half again, so I can go through multiple layers. And this side here, I went ahead and already cut it off, so I have a nice straight edge, because I always want to start off straight and everything's lined up down here. Now like I said, we want an 8.5 by 8.5 square, but first we're going to cut out strips, and you get actually 2.5 yard, and then from that we can cut it again, and it just makes it really quick for getting our 8.5 by 8.5. So from this edge I'm measuring over 8.5, making sure everything is lined up perfectly. Get my rotary cutter here. And I'm just gonna cut down. Again, after I cut this, I can move it over and then cut another one, and you should be able to get 2.5 yard. Then you're going to take each of your strips, and here's one strip here. Now I just laid it this way instead of this way. It's folded in half. I cut off my salvages, so I have a nice clean edge this way. Bring it over 8.5 inches. And cut this. So I have a perfect 8.5 inch square. So this one's already been cut. So I'm going to put this one to the side. Move this down so it's a little bit more in camera here. Use my roller to go down 8.5 inches, and then I'm going to cut another one. So this is how I create my blocks. Now out of one strip you should get about 5. You can cut out 2 at a time and get 4, and then the part that's here should just be about 8.5 inches. So that little extra that's on the end if you unfold it. So after you have all your blocks cut out, then we can start the fun part of putting them together. Next, we're going to be creating our strips out of the individual blocks because we're going to start sewing things together here. So what you're going to have is 5 strips and there's going to be 7 blocks in each strip. So you could put them in any order that you want. I'm just going to show you how I do it. So all I do is I separate each of my different blocks and I put numbers on them, as you can see up here, in kind of the order that I want it to go. So for strip number 1, I'm going to keep it really easy. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which gives me 5 blocks, but remember I need 7 blocks in each strip. So then I just start over. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. So this is going to be one strip that I'm just going to sew together, and when you're stitching it together it's going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once I have it kind of laid out how I want it, I'm going to place this block and this block right side together. Go ahead and use my straight pins to pin it. Stitch 1/4 inch seam allowance, so those are going to be stitched. And then it's going to be the same thing over here. This block and this block are going to go together. I place it right side to right side. Go ahead, pin it, stitch the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then do the same thing and the same thing all the way around. So this is strip number 1. We need 5 strips though. So I'm just going to move this one out of the way. And because I kind of don't want them to be perfectly lined up, when I do row number 2, I start with number 2 block. So I go 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. So that gives me 5 now, and I went through all of them, so I'm going to start over again. 2, 3, and then I stitch all these together in the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then for the 3rd row, I start with number 3, so I go 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 4, it's the same thing, so I'm just moving down, and so they won't be like all of this is all in one row. They kind of be more scattered throughout. So I just think it looks a little nicer. Of course, there's no rules. You do whatever you want. Now, if you start getting into quilting, it's a good idea to definitely have a big space so you can lay everything out and see how it looks. And if you like it, or don't like it, you can switch it up and change things. Also, people do like to use the cotton batting, so you get a big piece of cotton batting. If you have the room, you go ahead, pin it to your wall, and then these will actually stick to it, and you can look it up on a wall and move your pieces around that way if you don't have the floor space. So I'm going to go ahead and create my 5 strips. I'm going to do my 1/4 inch seam allowance on all of them, and then we'll move on to the next part. When doing a 1/4 inch seam allowance, your sewing machine may have a foot attachment that helps you keep your 1/4 inch seam allowance. So definitely check your machine manual for that. So I'm using my 100% cotton thread in order to do these seams, and I'm just doing a regular width. Don't forget to back stitch on both sides, and I'm just going to sew all my squares together. Make sure that you have them placed right side to right side as you sew them. After you stitch your seams in quilting, you should always press your seams. Now, there are different frames of mind. Some people say go ahead and press your seams open, and there are others that are insistent that you always press your seams toward the side. And if you do it that way, always go towards the darker square if you have a light one next to it. Now, there is no wrong way or right way. It's just whatever you prefer. For me, I'm going to go ahead and press my seams open just because I like my squares to lie flat. And what I do is I press it on the wrong side, flip it over, and press it again on the right side so I can have my blocks as flat and as nice and neat as possible. After I finish sewing all my blocks into strips, now what I can do is start sewing my strips together. So what I like to do is lay out all my strips in the order that I want it to go in the quilt. So here's strip 1, strip 2, all the way down to strip 5. Now when I lay it out, I like to lay it out so I want to make sure that my seams all match up here. Then I'm going to take whatever strip is on top, for in this case strip 1 is going to be sewn to strip 2, flip it over so the right sides are together, the edges meet, all the seams meet, and then I'm going to pin it and sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once that's done, don't forget to press it. Then I'm going to get strip 3 and I'm going to do the same thing down here. And so all my strips are then going to be sewn together, and that's going to create my quilt top. Now we're going to start creating our quilt sandwich. So that's going to be the backing, the batting, and then the quilt top. So they're all going to be layered together. So in order to create it, we're going to be using our basting spray here. So I have my backing, and I still need to press it. You definitely want to press it as flat as it can possibly get and as smooth. And what you're going to do next is we're going to adhere the cotton batting or whatever batting you're doing to the back. So I need to cut this so it's a little bit bigger than what my quilt top is, because we'll cut off the excess later, but we just need to make sure it's a little bit bigger. So this fabric is 45 inches in width, which is fine. And so I'm going to cut a length of 60 inches, so that makes it a little bit bigger than my quilt top length. So what I'm going to do is, now it's a good idea to read the directions on this if you have a different one, but basically mine is, you're definitely going to want to protect the surface because it is a spray adhesive, so we don't want to get it on our carpet or anything like that. You definitely want to work on a large surface, so whether or not, you know, that's in the living room or in your kitchen or whatever, just as long as you lay something down to protect your surface and it's just a large area that you can spread out everything. So you're going to shake this and then you're going to spray it onto, usually it's easier if you spray it onto your batting and then lay it onto your fabric. So that way if there's any discoloration, it ends up on your batting and not on your fabric. But what I like to do is I'm going to lay out my batting as flat as I can with my backing fabric. At the long edge, I'm going to roll it up, spray the top of my batting, and then slowly roll out my backing fabric. So I'm just like spraying, rolling, spraying, rolling, spraying, rolling until I get down to the end. And I'm smoothing as I go along, so it's all nice and flat and smooth. So my batting and backing are attached now. So now I'm going to basically do the same thing. Again, using the basting spray, I'm going to spray the top portion of my batting with my quilt top. I'm going to slowly just roll it out, smoothing as I go along so it's attached. Now it's a good idea to center your quilt top on this because we definitely don't want it to extend past the batting or past your backing, because again, we're going to cut it, the backing and the batting off in order to fit the quilt top. So you want to make sure that it's definitely center to the batting and the backing. If you don't have basting spray, or if you want added security, what you can do is use your safety pins and pin it through all 3 layers. You start in the center and you just kind of spread your way out. They should be about 6 inches apart. You don't need to break out a tape measure. I just kind of eyeball it. So I start in the center, work my way out, being sure to go through all 3 layers and kind of smoothing as I go. The reason why you start in the center is you don't want to start in this way and all of a sudden you have all this fabric bunched up. You're kind of pushing it out to the outer side. Now once you have it all pinned together, what we're going to do is what's called stitching in the ditch. So we're going to stitch using our machine right in the middle of our seam line here. So you're going to do it for all of your seams. So I'm going to go this way and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to go this way. So I'm going to go ahead, since I already have it pinned, I'm going to get out my sewing machine and we'll talk a little bit more about it. So the reason for the basting spray and the pins is we're trying to keep all 3 layers in place for when we sew it. Because if you don't and you just lay them on top of each other and you start sewing, what could happen is your layers will be together, but as you start sewing, they'll slide apart like this and they'll become uneven. So we just do whatever we can in order to make sure that that's not going to happen. Another way to do this, if you're thinking about taking up quilting and doing it a lot, is to get what is a walking foot. So as I sew, you'll see that the foot actually lifts up a little bit and kind of, it's moving the fabric on top, it's moving the fabric on the bottom with the machine. So everything is moving together. So that's why it's a good idea to have a walking foot if you decide that you want to do more quilting. So what I'm doing here is I'm just stitching right in the middle of my seam line here using a regular with stitch, and again I'm just using my regular cotton thread and I'm trying to stay right in the middle of that seam line. Now, if you're working with a quilt and the quilt feels kind of slippery, like you're not having a good grasp on it, a trick to use is to wear rubber gloves, like medical gloves, kitchen gloves. Any one of those rubber gloves will help you have a better grip on your quilt as you're working with it. So that should kind of cut down on the slippage a little bit. Also, since the quilt is so large, as you're doing this type of stitch, it starts to build up either on one side or another. So what you might have to do in order to prevent that is, I'll do it a little bit over here, just kind of roll my quilt up, and it's going to get quite large in this area, but once it gets so big I can flip over and do the other side of the quilt and do the same thing. So instead of just having it all willy-nilly bunched up like this, just kind of roll it neatly as you're getting more and more of a buildup over here. So that may help a little bit as well. So I'm just going to go down each seam line. Don't forget to back stitch on both sides because we don't want our stitching to come out. And this is what's going to secure all 3 layers together. Another option, instead of machine stitching all 3 layers together, is you can tie the quilt. And I usually do this if I'm working with thicker batting. So to tie it, it's an either or. You can either machine stitch it like we did the stitch in the ditch, or you can tie it. So to do it, this is going to be hand sewing. So I have my thread with my needle, and usually what I like to do is I like to do a tie in the middle of each square and then wherever there are connecting squares. So for this one I would do it here and in the middle. For one over here I would do in the middle, and then I would do here and here. You don't have to worry about it where it's on the edge. So to do it, and you can either do it with it facing up or you can have it with the back facing up to you. But I'm going to do it so it's a little bit easier to see with the top quilt showing. So we're going to go in the middle of my quilt. I'm going to pull it through, but I'm not pulling it through all the way. I'm going to leave about 4 inches sticking out. And then I'm going to come up really close to where I went in. Again, I'm going through all 3 layers. Now, of course, since it's hand sewing, it takes a little bit longer to do. So I just pulled my needle off, because all I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 2 parts of my thread and I'm just going to create a knot, bring it through. You want your knot to be pretty close to the fabric, and then you can trim it, and then you have these little parts that stick out. So it's kind of like an old-fashioned way to do it, of tying your quilt. And again, you can have the knot sticking on top so you can see it on the front, or you can flip it over so this is going to be on the back. And that's all you need to do in order to tie your quilt. Next, we're going to go ahead and trim off all our excess of the batting and the back of our quilt. So I'm not cutting into my top quilt at all. I'm just going to square everything up so everything lines up with that top quilt. So I'm just cutting all this part that's sticking out off. So everything will be lined up then. So now we're going to make the binding for our quilt. Now you can go ahead and buy pre-made binding at the fabric store. Unfortunately, it kind of has a limited selection, so I'm going to go ahead and use my extra backing fabric that I have and create my own. So here it is all laid out. It's just a single layer. It's not folded in half, and to do that, what we need to cut is bias strips. So that's going to be strips that are cut on the bias. So in order to create that, I'm going to grab this corner over here, bring it to meet this edge. So it's all lined up. Let's raise this up a little bit. All right, so this right here is the bottom of it. And here's the side, and here's the fold. Now you can go ahead and press this so you have a nice clean fold here. And you're going to want to do this on your cutting mat. Mine's a little big, so I'm not going to do it on camera. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut strips that are 2.5 inches in width. So I'm going to use my plastic ruler here to line it up with my 2.5 inch mark. And I'm going to go ahead, cut a strip, move this down, and continue cutting it. Then from there, I'm going to cut another strip. Now we're going to sew all the strips together in one long piece, and it should equal roughly about 5 yards of fabric. So if you cut all this up and you feel like you need more, we can go ahead and use this other half of our fabric to do it. So I'm going to cut this out, and then I'm going to show you how to sew our bias strips together in order to create our binding. So now you have a bunch of strips that should look like this. We don't want it to have a point here, so what you're going to do is you're going to square off the end, which you can see I've already done here. So I just line it up, I get my ruler, and then I cut off the point here. So once you have that, then you should have a bunch of strips with the end like this. So I would have it right side facing up. I'm going to grab another strip, and it's actually going to line up with the end here. Again, right sides are together. So right side down, this one's right side up. And it gets laid so they're going perpendicular to each other. I'm going to pin this. And then I would do the same thing. So this is the right side here. I'm going to lay this like this. Grab another strip. Right side to right side. Perpendicular to each other, lining up at the end. And I'm going to pin it to hold it. And let me just show you one that I have pinned here. What you're going to then do is you're going to stitch across from one end point to the other. So basically a diagonal. So I just measure from this point, I get my ruler, I find the point and the one in the bottom here, line them up and draw a line. So I have something to follow as I'm stitching it. So I'm going to do that for all of my strips so I have one long one. After you finish stitching your strips together like this, go ahead and trim that seam allowance so you only leave about 1/4 of an inch left, like this one here. And then you're going to press your seam open, which I've done on this one. So that's the right side, and there's the wrong side, and you can see it's all pressed open. So after I'm done with that, then we can start attaching it to our quilt. There are different ways to bind a quilt, but I'm going to show you one way that I find to be pretty easy. So with this way, you have to look at your quilt and you'll see that it's a rectangle. So we'll have 2 long sides and we have 2 sides that are shorter. So this is one of my long sides up here at the top. Here's one of the short sides. We're just going to be working with the 2 long sides right now. So you're going to take your strip, and I have it right side to right side. So here's the right side to the right side of the quilt, and I'm going to line it up with this edge here. Go ahead and grab your pins because we're going to need those. And I'm going to make sure all the raw edge here is lined up. And I'm going to pin it all the way down until I get to the other edge like this. Then once it's lined up, go ahead and trim it, and then you're going to do the same thing with the other long edge. So you're just going to pin it, both of the long edges, right side to right side with your binding, and what we're going to do next is stitch a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both sides. After you sew on your binding, you're going to want to press it out, and I have my seam allowance pressed closed, and it's pressed so it lies underneath my binding. I can feel it right here. So after you have the 2 long edges done, now we're going to do the 2 short edges, and it's a very similar process to what we just did. You're going to take your binding and you're going to line it up with the raw edge of your quilt. Now the difference is in doing this one, this edge is now going to line up with this edge of the binding. And just like you did before, after it's all pinned on both of the short ends in the same manner, you're going to stitch your 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then like this one, you're going to press this one away from the quilt with the binding pressed underneath, or the seam allowance pressed underneath the binding. So after that, we'll finish attaching our binding. Turn your quilt over so that you're looking at the back of the quilt. So here's the back of my quilt. You can see all my seams attaching my binding right here. So we're going to keep it very easy and basic to do this. All you're going to do is I'm going to take, this is one of my short ends here. I'm going to fold it so that the raw edge meets the raw edge of my seam allowance here. And if you want it to look nice and neat, you're definitely going to want to press this. So all that lines up. Then you're going to take this folded edge here and bring it so it just covers your stitching line here, because we don't want to see that. So it's going to cover like that. Go ahead and pin it in place. Again, you can press this so it looks nice and neat. And I'm going to do this all along my whole thing. Now, of course, when it comes to doing this other side here, just keeping it very simple, you're going to do the same thing. So this is going to meet the raw edge, and then I'm going to fold over to hide my thing. So this is on, obviously, the back of your quilt. Get that pin in there. So I'm going to do it all along this edge here. So that's how you fold it over, and then what we're going to do is do a slip stitch by hand sewing this folded edge to the back of our quilt so it'll look very nice and neat. So we're going to get a little closer to show you how that's going to work out. Alright, so now is the time that we're going to hand sew all our binding into place. So it's time to get a good movie on and to get comfortable, because this may take a while. So to start off with, I have my needle and thread, and it doesn't really matter where on the binding you start. I'm just going to start right here because I'm actually pulling up the folded edge of my binding here. So I'm looking at the inside, and I'm going to come up right on that fold line right there because I want my knot to be hidden on the inside. So nobody will know where I start or where I stop. Alright, so now it's coming out of the fold here. So right underneath that, I'm going to grab a little bit of my quilt backing, getting as close as I can to that fold because we want to kind of hide our stitches. Just grab a little bit of it. Be sure that you're only going through the backing fabric and not through the whole quilt because we don't want to see this on the right side. Pull it through. And now I'm going to grab a little bit of the fold. And then a little bit of the back, really close to that fold. Just going through the back fabric. You'll see I'm trying to make my stitches as invisible as possible. And you can see them a little bit if you look really closely, but hopefully nobody's going to look really closely at this. And then grab a little bit of the fold and then a little bit of the backing, and just doing this all the way around to all the binding is attached. And here we have our finished completed quilt. Now if you decide that you want to get more into quilting and explore more advanced quilt top patterns, you can still use these same techniques for putting the quilt together. Enjoy your new quilt! Make sure to check out our other videos and visit ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 100 sewing video tutorials. New tutorials are released regularly, so make sure to subscribe to be notified of the next release. Thanks for watching!